Welcome to the second lecture video of Module 7. And in your outline, this would be letter B, the nation. And we will talk a little bit about the things that occurred after the Pentateuch, after the Exodus story is completed. When you're looking at organizing the books of the Old Testament, most people would put them into four divisions, perhaps. You have the Pentateuch itself, the books of Moses. Then you have the history books, which begin with Joshua and move on all the way to Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, past Kings and Chronicles, and so on. And then you have the writings, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and so on. And then you have the prophets from Isaiah through Malachi. What we will do in this class is we've looked at the Pentateuch. This lecture focuses on the history books, particularly Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, Kings. And then the third video lecture for Module 7 will focus on the prophets and what we can learn there. Many scholars speak about what we could call a Deuteronomic history. This would be the first of two sections under 7b, if you're following that outline. And the Deuteronomic history is generally thought to go from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings in our English Bibles. In other words, Deuteronomy is like a constitution for the nation. It sets up the rules of relationship between God and the people Israel in their experience as a nation. But then Joshua, Judges, the Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, all of these books tend to judge the history of Israel in the light of Deuteronomy, particularly the books from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. So for many scholars, that is the Deuteronomic history. In other words, the history from Joshua to 2 Kings is one long illustration of Deuteronomy, and particularly the sermon in Deuteronomy chapters 5 through 11. And you might want to stop the video and read that if you would like. But there Moses lays out the God's plan for Israel and the good things that will happen when they follow his plan, and the negative things that happen when they don't. So the books of history from Joshua through 2 Kings are illustrating the principles of Deuteronomy, both positive and negative. Why would such a book be written? As I think a call to repentance and total commitment to the covenant God. Israel often was not committed, and the consequences become evidence as you look at the history. Now, Chronicles is interesting. Chronicles is not written by the same person who wrote Kings and probably Samuel as well. Chronicles is a parallel history in many ways. It actually begins with Adam. You could say if the Deuteronomic history really begins with Genesis, and Genesis through 2 Kings is like one single line of history. They're all following one after another, except the book of Ruth, which kind of drops in the middle there, but fits best in the time of the Judges. And Chronicles also begins with Adam, also begins with creation, and goes all the way to the exile and beyond, just as the Kings does. Chronicles goes actually a little bit further than Kings does. So in a real sense, you see the people of Israel making the same mistakes that Adam made, and ultimately it's a history of failure. When you look at the promises to Abraham, when you look at what the intention of all this history was, it ends up as a failure, because when you get to the end, you end up with a situation not significantly improved from that of the beginning. Certainly, if you're expecting the Garden of Eden to be restored, you'd have to say the history of the Old Testament is a failure, that Israel never attained God's purpose for Israel. You could say, in a sense, that's why many people have said the Old Testament by itself is not a good foundation for a religion. Because by itself, it's incomplete. It's sort of left hanging. And so the three great monotheistic religions have always added something. For Christians, of course, that something is the New Testament. The Bible isn't complete without the New Testament. For Muslims, there's the addition of the Quran. And the holy books are not complete until you have the Quran as well. For Jews, the added elements are the Mishnah and the Talmud, which elaborate on the principles of the Old Testament. So none of the three religions that see the Old Testament as a foundation see it as adequate in and of itself. It's in a real way incomplete. So in these history books, we see a crisis between God and Israel. Things are never quite turning out the way that they were supposed to. And that crisis is illustrated frequently in these writings by the tension between the prophet and the king. You have these two figures. In the time of the judges, the two were really blended into one. Samuel, Joshua, many of the other judges, Gideon and so forth, they combine some of the features of a king and some of the features of a charismatic prophet. But after the kingship comes into play, you have a tension between those two roles. You have Samuel on the one side and Saul. You have Nathan on the one side and you have David. You have Isaiah and Hezekiah, Jeremiah and Zedekiah, and so forth. So the crisis between God and Israel is illustrated by the crisis between the prophet and the king. So let's move past the promises and past the larger picture, and let's take a look particularly at the period between the Exodus and the establishing of the monarchy. And that is the period of the Judges. Because you see, when Israel came into the Promised Land, when they settled in the Promised Land, there was no strong central government. We're familiar with the monarchy. We think of David, we think of Saul, we think of Ahab, and so on. And here where you had a ruler, a strong central ruler that ruled over much or all of the kingdom. But that's not the pattern for the early centuries. For a number of centuries after the Exodus, there's no strong central government. Local control is primarily what is going on here. And this is well illustrated by a verse in the book of Judges, and that is verse 6 of chapter 17. So Judges chapter 17 and verse 6. It says, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit." Or perhaps more literally for the Greek, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This verse has often been pointed to by scholars along with the general tenor of the book to suggest that Judges might have been written with the specific purpose of suggesting that a king was needed, that strong central government was needed in order for Israel to succeed. So what you have in the book of Judges are cycles and cycles of chaos. A number of tribal stories, how individual tribes and localized groupings of tribes at times were facing challenges. And in those challenges, they handled the situation largely locally. So for example, the Samson story is associated with the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Dan was in many ways the most challenge to the tribes because they were located in Philistine territory, and the Philistines were the strongest of the local opponents of the Israelites. There were many Canaanite tribes that remained after the Exodus. The Philistines were not Canaanites. They actually had come from another place, but they were very, very strong. As it turned out in the long run, they were an equal match for all the 12 tribes together. So the tribe of Dan is kind of, right there, the border with the Philistines was under constant pressure. And so the Samson story shows how the tribe of Dan dealt with that somewhat successfully under Samson, and then later on they decided to pull up stakes and move to another part of the country that was not yet inhabited by Israelites. So they gave up the fight at one point and moved on. The book of Judges is a series of stories like this, about a dozen of them. You have 6 major judges, like Samson and Gideon and Jephthah and so on. And then you had a series of minor judges, most of whom we don't know about and don't name our children after. So some have suggested, it's not explicit in the text, but suggested that the 12 stories are one from each tribe. There do seem to at least 8 or 9 of the stories can be localized in that way. But it's not absolutely clear that that's the way it is. There's also the story of Abimelech, who was not a judge called by God, but who wanted to be such a judge and appointed himself and basically took on the role of kingship, contrary to God's intention. So that's the larger picture of Judges, and it's a cycle of chaos going on. The same story goes over and over again. For example, in the Exodus, you have a mighty act of God. Israel needs deliverance from enemy powers. And in a national, global sense, that is what occurs in the Exodus story. In the Judges, you have, in a sense, a number of mini reenactments of the Exodus story. For example, you have Israel faithful under a judge, just as Israel was reasonably faithful in the time of Joseph in Egypt. And then there's apostasy after the judge's death. Israel falls away. In Egypt, they come under slavery. In the Judges, this tribe may come under slavery or oppression from a localized Canaanite tribe. And because of their apostasy, God allows oppressors to make trouble for them. Under oppression, of course, they cry out for deliverance, and then Yahweh answers them by sending another judge. And you see this pattern over and over and over again in the book of Judges. There's a falling away, there's a cry for deliverance, and there's a mini reenactment of the Exodus that takes place. So many see in this chaotic situation an implied appeal for a strong central government, perhaps even a king. But kingship will bring its own problems, and these are addressed at the time when kingship comes in. And if we go to Samuel, 1 Samuel, chapter 10, let's take a look at some things that are said in the context of that situation. 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 17. And I think that will start on the next page. Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel up out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now rejected your God." Okay, that's a pretty strong statement. You have rejected your God, who saves you out of all your calamities and distresses, and you have said what? You have said, "No, set a king over us." So now present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. So God here is saying to them, in asking for a king, you're in a real sense rejecting God. And I think that's stated even more clearly in chapter 8 and verse 7, where Samuel is kind of complaining that the people are rejecting his leadership. But notice what God says here in verse 7. That's right, I have to turn the page again. And the Lord said to him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. So in these passages in Samuel, the kingship is kind of a conflicted situation. In many ways, a strong central government was needed, but a strong central government that followed God rather than others would have been the desire. The problem with a king is that once the king becomes a representative of the people to God, God deals with the nation through the king. When the king is faithful, the nation will prosper. But when the king is unfaithful, the nation will suffer even though there's good people in it. So Daniel, for example, suffers greatly because of the sins of the kings of Judah during his lifetime. And there was nothing his obedience could do about it. So God, dealing with the nation isn't dealing with the common denominator of the nation as a whole, but dealing with the king, who could be a very fickle person. Solomon, faithful for many years, and then very unfaithful for many years, and then kind of snaps back at the end of his life. So it can be argued that the monarchy was, in a real sense, a rejection of God. And there's an interesting feature of the Old Testament that seems to underline that. And I'd like to work that through with you briefly here. It's sort of a theology of the monarchy, if you will. Let's go back to Leviticus 26. Leviticus 26 sets some interesting foundations that we want to pay attention to here. Leviticus 26 and verses 27 and 28. And there in Leviticus 26 you have these blessings and curses, that if you obey, these good things will happen. If you disobey, troublous things will happen. And God shares a number of plagues that will take place. War, famine, pestilence, wild beasts, and so on, will occur if the people are not obeying God. God's protection will be taken away, and these unfortunate things will take place. So notice verse 27. If in spite of this you still do not listen to me, but continue to be hostile toward me, then in my anger I will be hostile toward you, and I myself will punish you for your sins 7 times over. Now, how will that punishment take place? Verse 33. I will scatter you among the nations, and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste, and your cities will lie in ruins. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbath years, all the time that it lies desolate, and you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the time that it lies desolate, the land will have the rest it did not have during the Sabbaths you lived in it. Now, important background to this text is that there was the principle of day-year embedded into the Israelite system, that the weekly Sabbaths, 6 days shalt thou labor, 7th day is the Sabbath, the Lord your God. In it you will not do any work. So 6 days to work, 1 day not to work. Most work back then was farming type work, so it's an agricultural kind of context. Parallel to that, is the sabbatical years. There is a week of years, 7 years, in which 6 years you're to work the land, and the 7th year the land is to have a Sabbath. Of course, we think in terms of crop rotation and letting land lie fallow from time to time to regain its fertility, regain its strength. And so you have a pattern of weeks of days, weeks of years. 6 days to labor, 6 years to farm. The 7th is a Sabbath. And so it predicts in Leviticus that if Israel did not obey God, they would need to give the land its Sabbaths. In other words, if Israel disobeyed God, overworked the land, then God would protect the land and would one day take them out of the land, send them into exile, so that the land could rest for all the abuse that it had suffered. So that's the principle. It's not the kind of thing we generally think about today, but it's important to understand where the text is going to understand this kind of foundation. So you have a prediction. If Israel does not obey, then the land will get its sabbatical years some other way. The fulfillment of this prediction occurs in 2 Chronicles, right at the very end of the history books. You have 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verses 20 and 21. 2 Chronicles 36 and verses 20 and 21. It says, "He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power." Now, this is describing Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Israel from Babylon and how many captives were taken back to Babylon. Now, here's the key point, verse 21. "The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation, it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah." Now, we're not going to read all these texts, but the prophet Jeremiah, toward the end of the monarchy period, makes the prediction that the Babylonians will come, will take the people captive, will take them to Babylon, and they will stay there for 70 years. So there's 70 years of exile in Babylon. But the interesting feature is that 2 Chronicles doesn't suggest it's just any 70 years. 2 Chronicles basically tells us these 70 years are sabbatical years. In other words, the quality of these 70 years is years where Israel should have let the land rest, but did not. They are symbolic of years of disobedience on the part of Israel. So it's important to recognize the exile to Babylon is counted as sabbatical years in 2 Chronicles 36. Now, there's one more text we need to read in relation to this, and that is Daniel chapter 9. And in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 2, we have a startling statement. Daniel 9, verse 2. "In the first year of his reign," and that would be the reign of Darius, son of Xerxes. "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet." You see the links here? Jeremiah keeps being referred to. So just like Chronicles, Daniel makes reference to that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So it's very, very clear that 70 years is the length of time of this exile, of this desolation of the land, and that these are sabbatical years. Now, it's in light of that, it's very interesting to see what happens at the end of this chapter. Daniel chapter 9 and verse 24. It says, 77s or weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And then it goes on to break up those 77s or 70 weeks of years. So you have 70 years of exile, and they're coming to an end. And Daniel wonders, what's going to happen now that they're coming to an end? And so Daniel hears from the angel that there will be 77s. Interesting. The 70 years are sabbatical years. That means that they're 1 out of 7. Out of a cycle of 7 years, 1 is chosen and called a sabbatical. The answer to the conclusion of the 70 years is another 77s. So you have 70 more but sabbatical cycles of 7 years each, producing 490 years at the end of Daniel 9. Here's the interesting point to take away from all of this. The 77s are a probation upon Israel, a renewed opportunity to follow God. The implication of Daniel 9 is it's not the first 77s in Israel's experience, because the 70 years of exile to Babylon are in response to the disobedience of Israel. They are sabbatical years that weren't served, that were neglected in the past. Now, the question I have for you is how many years of disobedience would be required to earn 70 sabbatical years? If Israel obeyed, they would work the land for 6 years, and then the land would rest. And they'd work the land for 6 years, and then the land would rest. But if Israel's not obeying God, how many years of disobedience would be required to generate 70 sabbatical obligations? And the answer is 420. You say, how did I come at that? 6 years of disobedience times 70 sabbatical years equals 420. 70 sabbatical years complete a period of 420 years in which disobedience occurred. And you have the full cycle of 490, 70 plus 420. Ezekiel actually seems to agree with this, because if you go to Ezekiel, you'll see at one point that the period of Israel's disobedience is entitled 430 years. Now, the reason for the difference between 420 and 430 is that Ezekiel is writing 10 years or so after the original captivity of Daniel, which would have been 605 BC. Now, if you take 605 BC, the year when Daniel went into captivity, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah, you go back 420 years, it takes you to 1025. What I want you to do at this point is go back to the learning materials page, the B part, the second part of Module 7, and go there and click on the link that's entitled The Monarchy, Joshua through 2nd Chronicles. And you'll see a chart something like this. I don't expect you to make sense of this from this video here, but you see what it looks like, okay? When you go to that chart, and I hope you have it in front of you now, you will see a time chart. You have 1025 in the upper line that says the monarchy. 1025, there's 420 years. That take us to 605. Now, what is 1025? What's the significance of that? That's roughly the coronation of Saul. We know that Solomon's temple was around 966 BC. So Solomon's reign started a few years before then. David's reign, perhaps 30 years or so, bring us back to 1000, and then Saul perhaps another 25 years back to 1025. We don't know the exact year when Saul was crowned king, but it's roughly 1025 BC. And so this whole concept of sabbatical years recalls to us the idea that the monarchy in a real sense was a failure to follow God, was a failure to be faithful. And then the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, they are modeled on an earlier period of probation that Israel failed. And now Israel will get a new opportunity. And one of the most popular ways of dating that, of course, is 457 BC to the time of Christ, around 27 to 34 AD. And so at the end of the first 490 years, you had the liberation of God's people from Babylon. And at the end of the 70 weeks of Daniel, you have the gospel going to the Gentiles, and therefore the liberation of the Gentiles. So please take note of that one, the monarchy link, the PDF that you have, and gives you a summary of these two charts of 70 weeks each. So the history of judges, the history of the monarchy, is in a strong sense a history of failure. Israel does not succeed in gaining everything that God had intended for it. So the Old Testament, in a sense, ends with a whimper rather than with a bang, and waiting for something bigger to occur. This will come clearer into focus when we take a look at the prophets. And in the next video lecture, which is 7C, we'll take a look at the prophets from Isaiah to Malachi and attempt to understand exactly the significance of that for an overall picture of the Old Testament. What we're doing here is reviewing in a nutshell the key actions that occur in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament becomes the foundation for the New Testament's picture of Jesus. As one writer said, in every page, every line of the Old Testament, you can see a picture of Jesus, but we don't often do that. And we're going to do that in this class, and I think that you will enjoy that. So this concludes Lecture 7B, a look at the nation, and we'll see you again when you're ready for the next lecture.